Central Okanagan Similkameen Nicola was a new riding created in 2015. It stretches from the American border through the Similkameen Valley up into the Okanagan, including Summerland, Peachland, and West Kelowna, and a little slice of Kelowna itself. Also includes Merritt, all the way to Logan Lake. Interestingly enough, it excludes Penticton, the hometown of our guest today on Up Front, MP for that riding, Dan Albas. Welcome to Up Front, and today our guest is Dan Albas, Member of Parliament for Central Okanagan Similkameen Nicola. That's a new riding.
It's quite a mouthful too. You did very well.
Thank you. I've been practicing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me here, Doug.
So originally you ran and won in the Okanagan Coquihalla riding in 2011, and the renamed riding in 2015. It's a fairly conservative area, but what do you think that you bring that to the voters that lets them pick you?
Well, first of all, I think when we kind of say it's a conservative riding or a liberal riding, I don't believe in the concept of safe ridings, especially if you look at our last election, there was a fair swing. I think what people are looking for more than anything now is a common sense approach to politics, nonpartisan. They want to see elected officials that take the time to listen and then to stand up with those concerns. I think that's something that I've been trying to do since I was first elected, and something that people, the approach that they like. So whether it be conducting a town hall in Merritt or doing a coffee conversations in Karamias with the mayor, these are things that you do because it's a big riding. And you know, while sometimes people may say, well, what's Kelowna have to do with Logan Lake? It's really my job as the Member of Parliament to be able to go and meet the people on their terms and talk about their issues in Ottawa.
And we want to talk a little bit about that because it is a pretty diverse riding. Yes. with the new boundaries, including parts of Kelowna all the way to Logan Lake and now the Similkameen. But you lost your hometown. Penticton got taken out of the mix.
Yeah, and again, it's the challenge you have as a Member of Parliament is you always want to try to come forward with knowledge. So 75% of my old riding was maintained in the current configuration. But it's also exciting for me too because now I get to hear about the issues in Princeton. Obviously, Logan Lake has a mine nearby, well, so does Princeton. Obviously, we have forestry both in Merritt and as well as Princeton. Our biggest private employer in West Kelowna is again Gorman Brothers, again a lumber company. So there's so much similarities, but again, every community has a distinct way of doing things, and so you got to really get to one-to-one and find out what makes that community tick.
What would you say you've been able to do for the riding since you've been elected?
Well, I said number one that I would make representations to government to make sure that infrastructure funding, that our area wasn't left out. And fortunately, the members, throughout the area have been very supportive because obviously Stephen Fuhr is a Liberal member, but we know that if we can make good arguments to Ottawa, that we can make the case, we'll see those funding investments made. And again, there's no right or left wing, so to speak, to a sewer pipe or to a water project. So people expect us as elected officials to work together and to put our differences aside when we talk about these important areas. Other areas, I've always been about the small guys, so to speak. Small family wineries in the last election told me they weren't able to get their products to other parts of Canada, which there still are issues with. Credit unions are incredibly important to our local economies, particularly for rural areas. Oftentimes there's not as many banking institutions, and they've had a really tough time from both the previous government and this current government. And I think it's because in Ottawa they just don't understand how credit unions are regulated and what they're really there to do. So I've started a credit union caucus with a Liberal Member of Parliament. And so, other members of Parliament like Elizabeth May and other NDP members are working with us to try and bring those issues forward. And again, because of my success on the wine front, I'm also co-chair with a Liberal member of the Parliamentary Wine Caucus. So there are ways that we try to work together as members of Parliament to make sure that we have the best information when government makes a policy change or as a Parliament we move forward.
So is that more challenging in opposition, obviously, than...
Well, our system depends on having good people on both sides of the aisle. And, the challenge in opposition is you have your soapbox, The government obviously has the keys to the car, but you're a bit of a backstreet driver. And at some point, if people aren't liking the direction that the driver is taking the car, they want to know that you have someone who's competent and who's able to look at the issues and be able to step up. And so, but again, I always relate back to, we're all elected as members of Parliament, whether it be the Prime Minister or Cabinet Minister first. And so it's our jobs to actually represent our jurisdiction, our ridings, to Ottawa, and to make sure those voices are heard. And so that's where I focused on, whether it be dealing with mortgage brokers and their issues with some of the changes the government has brought up, whether it be with private campgrounds who are experiencing very high tax increases from the previous administration, to just making sure that we start seeing some of these trade barriers provincially struck down. So these are all areas that I've been working on, and people, to the most part, regardless if they're political or not, have been very supportive of those things. And that makes me proud, because ultimately, whether or not someone voted for me, I want them to at least say, I'm happy with the representation I've had. I feel that I can hold my member of Parliament to account, either through a phone call, after a vote, or at a town hall, and that's how the system is meant to work.
Now, we're talking about sort of redistributing ridings and some of the possible changes to elections. One of the Liberal promises during the last election was to do with electoral reform, and now they're not going forward with that this time around. What are your thoughts on electoral reform and whether the first past the post is the best way to go? Sure.
Well, in BC, we had a gold standard. We had where the government recognized that some people took concern with the way that first past the post worked, and set up a public working group, an assembly, a citizens' assembly, which had the resources, got educated, put forward proposals after a lot of debate, and then had a referendum and funded both sides. That gold standard is probably how to do it. Unfortunately, I think what happened here is the government made a promise, didn't think it would get elected. Now they've recanted that promise, because their preferred option, which was for a ranked ballot, which oftentimes if someone is a Green voter or an NDP voter, they'll choose the Liberals as maybe as a second choice. And that would basically give them an ongoing advantage with voters to go at it. And obviously, when they held the parliamentary committee, they got off on the wrong foot. They made it a majority of Liberal members that would decide the final outcome. There was an outcry. They, to their credit, made some changes. But at the end of the day, the experts that came said that they wanted to see proportional representation. There's very little support for ranked ballot. And then second of all, the majority of this new committee that was proportionate to the House of Commons agreed that there should be a referendum. And both positions the government didn't want. And so it's had to publicly recant itself and to back away from that. And I think people were angry at them, because those people that wanted to see change, like a proportionate system, felt betrayed. And those people that felt that this whole process was a waste of taxpayers' dollars, and that a referendum, a true test, because ultimately, it's not up to me or any political party. We don't own the system. The people do. And so if you're going to make a big change to how someone votes, you should get the consent of them first for something as major as changing from first past the post. And to first past the post credits, it has produced one of the greatest countries in the world. I think sometimes we're a little bit humble that we have a peaceful, stable society, and we want to keep it that way. Now, whether or not electoral system needs to happen, that's something that should always start from and end with the people's consent.
Welcome back to Upfront, where we're speaking to Member of Parliament Dan Albas. Now, Dan, Conservative leadership race is underway right now, and you've come out in support of Maxime Bernier, yes, one of the more well-known candidates, very fiscally responsible, which I know probably appeals to you. He's been called the Albertan from Quebec. Why do you support him?
Well, first of all, I think that the Conservative Party benefits from principled leadership, and the ability to be able to communicate with any Canadian in their language, whether it be French or English, is a big asset. Maxime has a very principled vision for where he wants not just to take the Conservative Party, but also the country. And he's elaborated upon the ideas that he feels are very important. And he can communicate in both official languages. And I think as our population ages and as we see the millennials become more of a voting bloc, I think that there's a lot to be found there in terms of freedom, economic freedom. We see, in British Columbia, we still don't have the Uber, which is, an important thing. I think that a lot of young people would like to see. And the innovation that we want to see means government getting out of the way. And Maxime, I think, has the vision that can do that. Furthermore, when you look what's happening down south, you see that Mr. Trump and the new administration has been raising a lot of concerns as far as our competitiveness.
Right.
And so I think that Maxime has the right policies that are going to keep us competitive, that are going to keep investment here in Canada. And that's a big problem for any government, to make sure that Canada is competitive, and on the world stage, we're attracting that investment.
So are you talking about the supply management of things like poultry and dairy?
Yeah.
That's one of the things, if we're talking about what Trump has been talking about lately.
Yes, well, that was raised just quite recently, but one of the things that Maxime has been talking about is supply management. It only is about 10% of farms, but many consumers pay a lot in eggs, for chicken, for milk. And a lot of these farmers cannot, because of these tariffs, be able to send their goods out internationally. So what Maxime has said is that there's consumers are paying far too much for that, and it would be good for us, regardless of what the United States thinks, for us to revisit this and to propose a change to a more free market. It's a very conservative thing to do. It's good for consumers. On the flip side, he also is from a riding, Beauce, which has the most supply management in the country. Sometimes we want people, leaders to get in there and to make consensus and whatnot, but sometimes we want leaders to actually say, call a spade, and he's, again, willing to put some political capital, his own area, where he's at odds with some people. And I think that's the kind of leader we want, where they can see things as they are and say, is this fair to Canadians? And I think consumers deserve that break. They deserve that option. I think our farmers can compete. We have farmers that grow grapes. In British Columbia, we also grow all sorts of different berries, blueberries, raspberries, etc. And they send them right across the world. And that's, creating financial stability for farmers. And I think we can do the same thing with things like supply management.
We may talk a little bit more about NAFTA and free trade coming up, but I did want to ask you about in Maxime says it's pretty much a two-way race as he sees it with Kevin O'Leary. What are your thoughts on O'Leary?
Well, first of all, I think having 14 candidates, yes, it's a lot to choose from, but democracy shouldn't be neatly packaged. Yes, there does seem to be a breakaway where you have Maxime and Mr. O'Leary up front, but I'm also hearing from members that they also are starting to take a look at people like Aaron O'Toole and as well as Andrew Scheer, and that's a good thing for us. To have a good look at who the leader should be, because the leader is your chief spokesperson, and he or she should be able to communicate with people and to be able to do a good job of it. And if you can't even do that with your own members, how are you going to do that with the Canadian public?
Now, the Liberals have announced their legalization plans for recreational marijuana, and the proposed law came out last week. They have a lot of support from voters on this. What's your opinion on the matter? Maxime does support legalization. Where do you stand on it?
Well, first of all, the previous government would never have changed to this policy. But it was very clear in the last election that Liberals made it a clear part of their platform. They made that commitment to the voter. I actually wish that they would keep more of their commitments to their voters. That's what draws cynicism, when you see what they've done on electoral reform, on deficits and whatnot. But getting back to marijuana specifically, they did campaign on it, and they did win a majority mandate, and so I believe they have the Democratic mandate to do that. So now we need to move from the question of whether or not they should do it to how they are doing. And so there's lots of questions. So again, how do you regulate something where you have a legal pot and regular pot looks the same? So how do officials tell the difference? How do you regulate THC levels? The moment you say you're going to say we're going to have this much THC levels, that's going to create pressure on an underground market to supply consumers with more. There's questions about you would be able to use it legally here in Canada, but what happens at the border? There's also a number of international agreements and conventions that we've signed on, and the government has been silent on all of these points. Will there be GST on it? And to be fair, the government has said, similar to what happened with my bill on interprovincial transport for wine, is that they basically said there's a federal rule that prohibits wine between provinces. We're going to allow provinces to we're going to step out of the way and let provinces regulate. That's a very similar approach to what they're taking here. The problem is, though, is that, who's going to sell it, what terms, how is that going to work with work-safe regulations and whatnot? So my job at this point isn't to get into the argument of whether they should or not. It's the whether or not the plan they're proposing is safe and will do what they say that they'll do. That's, to me, is my role as a member of parliament, and I'm meeting lots of people on both sides of it to ask the questions. And really, that's what opposition should do, is to ask the government to make sure it's thought these things through.
People with serious crimes, even including murder, are being let go because of the huge delays. What are your thoughts on this, and on what are ways maybe to speed the process up?
Well, first of all, one of the chief criticisms, I think, that the Minister of Justice has right now is that she proposed a whole review of how we promote justices, and for maybe what is very well-intentioned aims to see, more diversity reflected on the benches. The problem you run into is that government sometimes moves very slow, particularly when it's a well-established framework. And so we've seen such a slow process of appointing new judges that now people are questioning whether or not justice is happening. And like I said earlier, I want elected officials to keep their promises, but at the same token, you always have to weigh the cost. And I would prefer that, first of all, I think most Canadians would say, whoever sits on a bench has to have merit. Now, having those other attributes, proper gender, proper diversity, I think everyone supports that. But no one I've talked to supports an idea that we'll do that first while people are released on serious crimes, sexual assault, murder, with no actual charges. And to be fair, it's also bad for the person that has been charged with a crime because they don't have their day in court. So this is this is basically hurting our faith in the justice system. So I would really encourage the government to start being not just fair, but practical in these appointments, put merit first, and then build into the system over a period of time the kind of bench that you want to see. But let's focus on making sure that the person on the street feels that the justice system not only looks out after their interest, but runs things smooth and efficiently so justice is done. That's basic what I've heard from constituents, and that's something that I'd like the government to focus more on.
Thank you very much. We will be right back with more from Dan Albas. Welcome back to Up Front, where we're talking to Dan Albas, Member of Parliament for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. Now, we did go to the streets, Dan, in West Kelowna and talk to a few people to get some of your constituents' questions for you. And we'd like to play you the clip for it. So here we go. Here's our first tape.
People that are trying to get on maybe a social assistance or whatever, like that kind of stuff, they make it rather too complicated. It took a friend of mine 18 hours to get into the system, and if you're not really together or you've got manic depression or schizophrenia and stuff like that, I would say that it's really too complicated, and I think they could make it a little bit easier for that situation.
So basically talking about mental health issues, getting on social assistance, and some of the barriers that exist there.
Well, first of all, this gentleman is completely right. If someone does have mental health challenges, to suddenly go into a system where you're being asked to check a bunch of boxes and to present a bunch of information can be very challenging. And so we're very fortunate in this country that we have lots of civil society groups, and some are actually societies that are founded by the province that receive some provincial money. This is a provincial issue when we're talking about social assistance itself. But again, there are programs federally, for example, the Canada Pension Plan Disability. And sometimes that system takes a little bit of help. And so what I would encourage people to do is, talk to your member of parliament. If it's a federal issue, talk to your MLA if it's a provincial one. And just try and reach out and get those resources. But it is a challenge, and I'm very much in favor of streamlining things to make it easier, recognizing what it's intended to do, and to make sure it gets there. Now, on the flip side, Many people, though, want to make sure that there aren't processes that can be, that are so generous that people, defraud the system. That's something you always have to be wise of. And that's really where government needs to find that balance, making sure that the people who need the help can get it in a quick and efficient manner, while also making sure that taxpayer dollars are being given out to the people that need it the most.
Now, another question that we've heard of, and I'm sure you've heard it from your constituents, especially considering you've got a pretty long stretch of border with the United States running through it, is the refugees crossing over from the United States into Canada. And it's been a trickle throughout the winter, but now that the weather's warming up, is there a worry that could turn into a flood? What kind of steps do you think should be taken?
Well, this is a growing issue, and I have to say many constituents have reached out. Now, in the last Parliament, we actually passed in 2012 updates to our refugee legislation, and the government hasn't made a lot of changes to that at all. Basically, if you come from a safe, democratic, human rights, rule of law country, you're not eligible. And let's say if you're a gay person escaping Iran, if you're a Christian escaping from China, those are the kind of cases that, where you have someone who's being clearly persecuted, and obviously they're not safe countries in terms of the rule of law and due process. And so someone still, when they cross that border, they are, again, brought to the attention of CBSA. They do go and work with the government to identify who they are, and then they go through that process. And that has not substantively changed. So we'll see how that independent of government process works. If someone disagrees, if they're found ineligible and someone disagrees, they can get in front of an immigration judge so they can argue their case. But I will say that part of the issue is Prime Minister Trudeau. He has a very generous spirit. Wants to encourage people to look at Canada as being engaged in the world. But I think he made a mistake by tweeting out, welcome to Canada, because it gave a lot of people, I think, the false impression that we don't have processes that need to be respected. And we are a generous people. We are also a practical people. And so we don't want to have it where people are taking advantage of a system when there are legitimate people that are waiting in line, have filled out their paperwork, and are going through that system. So it's a balance. It's something that the government needs to be very attentive to. I am a little disappointed that the ongoing reporting has been cut off from CBSA and the RCMP directly to the media. The minister did say that a more fulsome report will be coming forward. And so I look forward to seeing that in case this becomes an issue that mushrooms much larger than the government intends. But again, that's why we have immigration processes. That's why we have these independent immigration review boards and judges to make sure that the right people are going through the steps and that there's due process.
All right, now we're going to take another one of our questions that we collected from viewers out on the street. Have a quick look at this.
What's happening with the roads in coming off of the bridge, especially with all the congestion coming out and going in from the west side, is like a nightmare. If they will fix it, that would be great.
So transportation in and out of Kelowna, probably not in your bailiwick, but how do you respond to her question?
Well, I think it's important that elected officials hear what a community's concerns are. So, for example, in Peachland, there's been a lot of discussion about a potential bypass. West Kelowna, there's talk about perhaps a second crossing or whatnot. Really, the federal government only gets involved if a province identifies a priority and that there's infrastructure money for that. So I would just encourage people to speak to your elected officials, have those discussions, and if a project and the evidence that goes behind it is there, government has to to take care of these kinds of basic infrastructure needs like roads.
Now, you, of course, are well known here in the Okanagan for your support of the interprovincial wine trade. And recently, there was an attempt to come up with some kind of wider spread free trade across Canada, if you would have it. What's your take on that and the results of that?
Well, it should be acknowledged that former Minister James Moore from British Columbia initiated a process with his provincial counterparts to say, listen, if we're going to grow the economy, let's give people the same access to markets as we do with South Korea, for example. They have access to municipal procurement right across this country. And now with CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union coming online, someone in Belgium will have where they can bid on work right through this great country. And yet people in British Columbia are not able to bid on work in Ontario and Quebec up until this point. So the fact that we've seen some positive steps like municipal procurement means that the taxpayers are going to get more choice and probably more competition, which means savings. But on the flip side, I just have to take a step back, Doug. It is preposterous to me in a country that's about to celebrate its 150th year that we need to have a free trade agreement with our provinces. We're one country. It's very clear in the debates of Confederation, this was not meant to just be a political union, but an economic one. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now. The province of New Brunswick, to its credit, has brought forward the Como case about a man who tried to bring alcohol across a provincial barrier, what they say illegally, got fined by the RCMP. He took it to court. It's gone all the way up, and now if the Supreme Court hears that case, I think it would have huge change, not just for the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that was just signed, but whole parts of the economy. And to me, that's a good thing. And so I really do hope that the Supreme Court hears that case.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time. Lots of great questions and lots of great discussion. And we look forward to talking to you more coming up in the future. Hopefully, you'll come back to the studio.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. That is it for Up Front. Thank you very much to Dan Albas, Member of Parliament for our Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.